Right, here we are. And as I said before, excuse me, I have a cough, but I'll throw it off one day. Right, the RAF in South Russia and over the Caspian Sea, 1919, 1920. And it was described as a really nasty, dirty little war by Air Vice Marshal Christopher Bilney, who was a captain in 266 Squadron over the Caspian in 1919. His memoirs are available online, and they're quite interesting reading. In essence, he went to Russia to avoid being unemployed. He thought that was the best way to get a permanent commission in the RAF. So the Russian Civil War was the major byproduct of the Great War, and as the armistice came into effect on 11 November 1918, Red artillery was starting to shell Allied positions at a town called Tulgas on the Dvina River in North Russia. So the war didn't end. Well, not for the troops who were there. Allied intervention in Russia is generally forgotten in the Western countries, but certainly wasn't in the Soviet Union. It was a point that I think Khrushchev made to, must have been Eisenhower, I suppose, American president, that we haven't forgotten the first thing you did when we had a revolution was send troops to put it down. And the Americans had no idea what he was talking about. So to explain the role of the RAF, I'll have to outline the white struggle in South Russia. So, right, in early 1919, after the revolution, Russia was under the control of the Bolshevik Party, led by Vladimir Lenin. Looks very handsome there and quite proud of himself. Seized power late 1917. The Bolsheviks are generally called the Reds, and anti-Bolshevik forces were known as the Whites. They opposed the Reds and intended to overthrow the current rulers. In summary, Lenin was not a very nice person, but he did keep control of the country. On the other side, the Whites were split into 5 uncoordinated main fronts. Archangel and Murmansk in the north, supported by the British. The Baltic, also supported by the Royal Navy. Poland and Ukraine was sort of supported a bit by the French. South Russia, mainly support from Britain. And Siberia, where the Trans-Siberian Railway was held by the Czechs. There was support from the Japanese, who actually wanted to stay there, plus Americans, British, and others. The more or less leader of the White Russians was Admiral Kolchak, who was based in Siberia. And at the same time, several nations, that's Finland, Poland, the Baltic countries, Ukraine, declared their independence from Russia. There was another school of thought on the Russian side. They didn't want them leaving. And there are traces of that even today. Kolchak had little influence on things outside Siberia, and he was eventually executed by the Reds in 1920. There are the battlefronts in early 1919. As you can see at the top, unfortunately I haven't got a pointer, but you can see the Murmansk, Archangel, and then the fronts on the left there of Poland and Ukraine, then down to South Russia, and then to the right is Siberia. So the problem that Whites had is that they couldn't coordinate an attack at the same time. So the Reds had the advantage of internal communications and unified leadership. And it has been said that in essence, the Reds believed they had something to fight for, while the Whites were fighting against something, which wasn't quite as easy to drum up support. The war was brutal, and the Whites and Reds both committed numerous atrocities. Civilians dreaded the approach of both sides, as a captured town would merely be looted. Captured by the Reds meant trials by the Cheka, the Red secret police. And a Cheka trial wasn't about establishing if people were guilty or innocent. It was just degree of guilt and hand out a sentence. Anti-Semitic programs were a feature of White rule, and there was a belief that the Reds were actually sponsored by Jews or run by the Jews, and so that was an excuse to slaughter a few of them. The battlefronts moved quickly. They were dominated by cavalry and armoured trains. You can see White cavalry there, Desertion was common in both armies, whole regiments just suddenly changing sides, and mass defection to the enemy was common. Allied intervention. Before the armistice, the Allies had sent a lot of supplies to Russia, and they sent troops to guard these when Russia looked like pulling out of the war. And Britain was the leading power in this regard. Winston Churchill, the Minister for War and Air, was a fervent anti-Bolshevik. He had very dim views of people who went around slaughtering aristocrats. And he committed increased numbers of troops, plus naval units and the RAF, to both North and South Russia and the Baltic. There were hopes that with Western support, the Bolsheviks could be defeated. His enthusiasm wasn't really shared by the population, who really had enough of the war, fighting Germany. Intervention in South Russia was divided between the French, who were west of Odessa and up into Ukraine, and by the British to the east of Odessa. The British supplied artillery, tanks, uniforms and training, plus aircraft to white troops. And there's a preserved Mark V tank. There are quite a number of them in Russia. When the Allies pulled out and left tanks behind, a lot of them were impressed into the Red Army, and they stayed there. So there's a number of them there. Britain, as the supplier of goods, many of the white armies actually wore British uniforms with Russian badges. In fact, so the troops who received the uniforms were often lucky, as thanks to corruption, a lot of them didn't make it as far as the troops. And it was noted by a number of officers in South Russia that lots of civilians wore clothes made from British uniforms, including ladies of easy virtue who wore uniforms manufactured from nurses. Right, so we'll start with the Caspian. In 1919, Iran was called Persia, so the bit down the bottom would be Persia, and the rest of it was then Russia. In 14 November, the British decided to deploy the 62nd Wing RAF to the Caspian to support the Royal Navy. There was quite a substantial Royal Navy presence on the Caspian. And the wing was to provide 221 Squadron with DH-9s, 266 with short 104s and 320s, and 186 Squadron with Handley Pages was to join them, but the move was cancelled.
Gareth,
Yes.
how did the Royal Navy get into the Caspian Sea?
They seized ships that were already there. We'll get to that. The RAF had been to the Caspian before that. Some aircraft, I think they were SPAD 7s, from 30 Squadron, operated from Baku, which is the one with the little red dot on the peninsula sticking out, when the Ottomans were attacking it in late 1918, just before the end of the Ottoman Empire. There's a lot of oil around there, and the Turks had an idea of grabbing it. So 221 Squadron was the first one to go there, and originally it was formed at Lemnos with DH-9s in December 1918, moved to the Caspian. I think that the aircraft actually went there by train. Squadron members were posted to Russia. They didn't worry about volunteering, they were simply sent there, and they arrived on HMS Empress, another Empress ship, in January 1919. And there's one of them, the one that's pictured there, appears in a lot of illustrations of DH-9s, with that sort of singular colour scheme with the arrow on the side. They were supplemented by DH-9As in August. The thing with the men going there, these were all just you're told you've been posted to Russia. As they'd been there for a while and it was uncomfortable, a lot of them felt that as they joined up to fight Germans, the German war was over and they wanted to go home. However, there were some men who were happy to volunteer to avoid unemployment, or they were career servicemen. A lot of or some officers who'd been captured had been sort of left behind in the career stakes, and they were happy to go to Russia to try and advance their career, catch up with their friends who'd been on the Western Front. And there were some with firm anti-Bolshevik feelings. The commander of 221 was Major John Oliver Andrews, who served in the Royal Scots. He's English, but served in the Scottish Regiment, transferred to the RFC and Observer in January 1915. He was mentioned in dispatches for service in 5 Squadron and qualified as a pilot. With flying DH2s of 24 Squadron, credited with 7 victories, then 5 victories from Sopwith Pups with 66 Squadron. Then he was commanded 209 Squadron RAF, then 221 from 20 December. He was evacuated from Russia in April 1910 with typhus. He was apparently a very confident man, and there's an account in one of the books about when they were unloading the aircraft at Petrovsk. The driver was a bit hesitant about driving a Ford T out through the gates of the dockyard, and Andrews said, ridiculous, hopped into the driver's seat and headed off for the gate, went through the gate, then had to stop while they took up the mud, put the mud guards back on the car. And so, but he was a good pilot. Right, Petrovsk, and there's a photo of the place there, the railway station. It's the base of the 2 squadrons operating over the Caspian. And aircraft from Petrovsk supported white forces advancing on red positions to the north near Grozny, which you'll remember appears in the was in the news a few years ago as the capital of Chechnya, which was trying to be opt out of Russia. And they also bombed red naval units in Astrakhan, which is 380 kilometres to the northeast. Petrovsk is now called Makhachkala, or something like that, which was in the news a few months ago when the Russians shot an Azerbaijan airliner they thought was a Ukrainian drone, and the aircraft tried to land it at what was Petrovsk, but the airport was closed and had to limp across the Caspian and crash on the other side. But yeah, I don't know if the airport they were aiming for was the older RAF base. Hasn't been changed since then. There's Astrakhan being bombed, and that's where the excuse me for a second. Where the Volga River enters the Caspian and is the base for the Red Caspian Fleet, which is all icebound for the first few months of 1919. Red ships in the Volga were beyond DH9 range, but the Whites captured Chechen Island, which is a little bit north of Petrovsk, and a fuel depot was established there, and the DH9s could refuel them. When the DH9s were replaced by DH9As, they could bomb it without a need for a fueling stop. And you can see Astrakhan being bombed. In June 1919, a DH9A was shot down by a red Newport, and the crew was captured. Captured aircrew were generally fairly well treated, and they were released in 1920. There's an interesting story about a captured pilot in North Russia who decided to preserve his uniform and flew wearing overalls. And when he was shot down and captured, the Reds decided, man in overalls, he's a member of the downtrodden proletariat. They treated him quite well indeed. I don't know if he told them. Right, the next unit to go to Petrovsk was 266 Squadron with their short 184s, and there's a photo there of one being loaded into the water at Petrovsk, and you can see the crane was not designed to handle a thing like an aeroplane. Problem they had is that the Caspian is less salty than seawater, and the shorts have been designed to operate off seawater, so they used to sink much further down into the water, and taking off was a bit of a problem. So they obviously overcame it, but they would patrol seeking for red shipping, which they would report to the Navy or try and bomb it. They were also tasked with training Russian airmen, but as Bilney explains, with limited success. The Russians, he said, just weren't interested. And then in August 1919, both squadrons were withdrawn, and the aircraft were transferred, the DH9As, were transferred to number 47 Squadron, which we'll get to. the Royal Navy also just deployed coastal motorboats in the Caspian, the torpedo boats at the time, which again patrolled looking for red shipping. There are 2 seaplane tenders which they used to take the shorts up closer to Astrakhan, but the local ships commandeered and impressed into the Royal Navy. And the interesting one is the flagship of the Caspian flotilla, HMS Kruger, originally built in 1902, named President Kruger after the Boer leader during the Second Boer War, and probably the only Royal Navy vessel to be named after an enemy of the British Empire. Surprised they didn't give it another name, but. Right, the opposition was the Workers' and Peasants' Air Fleet, and generally they were licence-built Newport 17s. They're quite a front loader, but the problem that they had was the reluctance to allow the hierarchy was reluctant to allow pilots to go off on sorties over white territory because generally they were ex-Tsarist officers and there was a good chance of them defecting, which made life a bit hard. Another type that they encountered was the Grigorovich M9 flying boat, and you can see one in Imperial service there, and that they were often mistaken for Franco-British aviation flying boats, which they partly resembled. And there's an interesting story about to overcome the problem of pilots defecting, a Czech agent was put on board a 2-seater flying boat and told to shoot the pilot if he looked like defecting. And obviously, after they'd been flying for a bit, the Checker man thought, no, if I shoot here. So they both defected. Right, so number 47 Squadron, formed in the UK and flew on the Macedonian front. They used a number of aircraft, and then in August 1918, A and C flights were equipped with the DH-9, and they moved to Russia early 1919 to support General Denikin's army. You can see there's a book that covers their exploits, mainly in Macedonia, written by Henry Albert Jones, ex-Wiltshire Regiment, and he was an observer in the squadron in Macedonia and the author of volumes 2 to 6 of The War in the Air, the official history of the Royal Air Force, of the British Air Services. It was commanded by Major Raymond Collishaw, DSO bar, DSC, DFC, and a bit of an Elon Musk lookalike. He served there on the Western Front, credited with 60 victories, 34 while flying Sopwith triplanes. He was the most successful Sopwith triplane pilot. He was credited with 1 victory over South Russia, which he claimed as an albatross, which seems unlikely. I don't think any albatross has got there. It was more than likely a Newport, another V-strut thing. And in the melee of combat, he identified it as an albatross. There was also the RAF training mission, and with RE-8s. And the idea was that they were going to train Russians to fly RE-8s, but the Russians, there were a couple of fatal crashes, and the Russians said, no, we won't fly them. And so they tried, but it didn't work at all. So they gave it up. So 130 RE-8s were sent to Russia, 160 DH-9s or DH-9As, 50 Camels, and 15 SE-5As. The SE-5As weren't unpacked, but they were captured by the Reds after the Allies had withdrawn. That's the theatre of operations for 47 Squadron. Taganrog, right in the middle there, is where the RAF instruction mission was based. It's about, I think, about 450 kilometres from Taganrog to Tsaritsyn, which was then the name of Volgograd. To just give you an idea of the scope of the area they were flying over. and they were supporting General Anton Denikin, an ex-RS general. He was quite a competent general, but let down by all the things that went wrong in Russia. Corruption, lack of supplies, indifferent troops who weren't really interested. But he tried hard, and disease was another major problem. 47 Squadron they're officers of sea flight, the DH9 flights. Collishaw is in the middle with the dark shirt on, in the middle of the middle row. There's two other people who we'll get to who have a remarkable story. Captain Anderson to the right of Collishaw and Mitchell behind him. Just have a look at the uniforms. You've got a collection there of RAF khaki and light blue. There was the detested light blue with gold trim uniforms they didn't like. The khaki ones had gold trim as well, or gold rank badges. But there are also RFC uniforms, Army uniforms. The man in the front in the definite Royal Navy uniform, and the man on the extreme left is in Russian is a Russian. The interesting thing is that Russia might have been the first time the RAF came across RAF blue, because that was the colour used for Imperial Russian cavalry breeches. And there was a big order for these breeches by the Tsarist government. Come the revolution, the new government said they didn't want them, so there were stacks of this grey-blue uniform in Britain, and in late 1919, when the RAF was looking to change from khaki, someone must have said, "Oh, we've got all this grey-blue uniform. Why not try that?" Right, 47 Squadron. There's some photographs of their DH9s at Ekaterinburg. They started bombing railways and bridges near Tsaritsyn just before Denikin's forces captured the place. And that was the beginning of a constant program of bombing of targets. And on 30 July, two DH9s set off to bomb barges on the Volga and attack cavalry. One was flown by Captain Anderson and Lieutenant Mitchell, the other by Captain Elliott and Lieutenant Laidlaw. Both machines in heavy ground fire. Right. Anderson's aircraft was hit by ground fire, causing a leak in the starboard fuel tank. Mitchell clambered out onto the wing and plugged the leak with his hand while grasping a centre section strut. He was wearing shorts and he was burned by the engine exhaust. It became apparent that red fire had damaged the engine of Captain Elliott's DH9 and it would have to land. So you got one aircraft with a leak in the fuel tank being plugged by hand, and they landed next to the other aircraft. So he landed Anderson landed as close as he could. Meanwhile, they could see Red Cavalry approaching, and the Red Cavalry is probably not going to be very hospitable to people who've just been shooting him up and bombing him. So Elliott attempted to set fire to his machine. In his report, he said he did burn it, but there are photos of it it's just wreckage. He and Laidlaw ran to the DH9, the other DH9, ground in the rear cockpit. Laidlaw used the Lewis gun to keep the Reds at bay. And then Mitchell clambered back onto the wing and stuck his fingers in the holes in the fuel tank. The DH9 staggered into the air, and it took some 50 minutes. I think it was about 110 miles to get back to base. Collishaw recommended that both Anderson and Mitchell be awarded the VC, but for various reasons, DSOs were awarded instead. Two VCs were actually awarded to soldiers, both ex-AIF in North Russia, and two VCs were awarded to the Navy in the Baltic, but nothing for South Russia. A and C flights continued to attack Red positions during the summer, and A flight finally received the DH9s that 221 Squadron had been flying. In September 1919, some war-weary camels arrived from the Mediterranean. They'd all been flying with squadrons around the Aegean Islands. After refurbishment, they became B flight led by Sam Kincaid. They fought Red aircraft with several successes, but spent most of their time attacking ground forces. And there's a couple of wingless camels there at a railway station.
With snow.
Well, it's, no, it looks pretty bleak. Right, Kincaid, ex-RNAS, RAF, commanded 201 Squadron, credited with 33 victories over the Western Front and at least 2 over Russia. Unfortunately, he was killed in 1928, flying a Supreme S-5 seaplane as part of a Schneider Trophy bid. But apparently a good man, good pilot. All right, the workers and presence airfield, another shot of them with Nieuports, or a Newport, and two stop with 1.5 Stratas. Right, I've mentioned Tsaritsyn a few times. It was a major city and a rail centre on the Volga, and held by the Reds, described as the Verdun of the East. You can see red defenders there in a painting of red defenders in a trench. The Whites attempted to capture the city 3 times before succeeding in June 1919 in an attack spearheaded by tanks. The Red infantry weren't interested in tanks at all, at least the look of them, they generally depart. In the painting, you can see a gentleman on the right with a bit of a fairly heavy moustache, Joseph Stalin, who played such a good part in the defence of Tsaritsyn and eventually recapture that he named it after himself. So that became Stalingrad. After the capture of Tsaritsyn, Denikin decided to move on Moscow. Not a good idea. So they moved up north with the avowed aim of capturing Moscow, but it didn't work. Overstretched supply lines, Red attacks, forced the advance to stop. They made 710 kilometres from Tsaritsyn, but they were still 370 kilometres south of Moscow. It was the closest the Whites got to the capital. And they couldn't stay where they were, and they started to retreat. You can see the photos of a white armoured train, complete with artillery. The White retreat, they just had to, they were harassed by Reds all the way, suffering enormous casualties from typhus. And the RAF continued to lend support where possible, but the Red Army then besieged Tsaritsyn in turn, and it fell in January 1920. And that was really the end of any White hopes of victory. 47 Squadron worked hard in support of White forces, and they are now supporting Wrangel, who was General Peter Wrangel, who held Tsaritsyn, and they bombed ground positions and vessels on the Volga as the Reds tried to attack, and the Camels kept attacking ground troops and aeroplanes. Air combats were infrequent, and the RAF were usually the victors. Peter Wrangel was a descendant of a family after whom Wrangel Island is named, which is an island about the size of Crete in the Arctic Ocean, and its claim to fame was the last place inhabited by a herd of woolly mammoths. So, it disappeared some years ago, but the Reds kept trying, and on 12 October, a force of about 5,000 Red cavalry, probably led by Boris Demenko, swept between 2 White armies and threatened to attack Tsaritsyn from the west. If the attack had been successful, there was a good chance that B-Flight would have been cut off from the rest of the White forces. As I'll explain, 2 Camel pilots helped to halt the attack. Demenko was one of the best Red cavalry leaders, but he had the misfortune to be a rival of Joseph Stalin, and he was executed in 1920 for counter-revolutionary activities. Right, as I said, the Red cavalry was attacked by 2 Camels, and they were the only serviceable machines they had at the time. One flowed by Sam Kincaid, and the other by Lieutenant William Burns Thompson. The pilots flew at low level, firing the Vickers guns, dropping Cooper bombs, causing major confusion among the Red Horsemen. Charged by White cavalry, then routed the attackers. Some accounts say there were 4 Camels, but there were only 2. Burns-Thompson went on to be killed in Egypt in 1922, flying a civil Sopwith Camel in an unauthorised low flight over Abu Sur aerodrome. In 20th October, in the response to public unease about British servicemen continuing to fight in Russia, 47 Squadron was retitled as A Squadron RAF instructional mission. And at least one aircraft, that one, was repainted in Cuban Air Force markings. So they're old Zaris markings of red, blue, white roundel with a white stripe. And looking at some other drawings of Cuban aircraft, the tail was black with a white bar on it. It's hard to tell in this one whether it's black or PC-10. The aircraft in the background looks like a DC-9 or DH-9 or DH-9A, but still in RAF uniform. Retitling the unit allowed the British government to truthfully say no one from 47 Squadron is fighting in South Russia.
And what's the Cuban Air Force?
One of the sub. There are a number of would-be sections of the White Offensive, allies of Denikin, but still trying to be their own country as well. Right, one of the other characters who pops up in this is Marion Ayton, US-born pilot, son of a Texas Ranger, flew in B flight from August 1919, and he wrote a book, Last Train Over Rostov Bridge, and his ghostwriter was given a free hand. And among things, he claimed 5 victories over Russia, 3 of them in April, which, given that he arrived in August, is not a bad thing. But the book is a good account of the struggle and how the White Cause fell apart and the problems of typhus and trains, and stayed in the RAF till 1927 and died in the USA in 1961. The instructional mission was disbanded, C Flight was disbanded, and the DH-9As were transferred to the Whites. So they formed a new C Flight with RE-8s left over from the instructional mission, the ones that the Russians wouldn't fly. The problem with DH-9s and DH-9As is they, because of the cold, they couldn't get water for the radiators, so they stopped flying. They were still able to fly RE-8s, and so Z Flight was formed with RE-8s and attached to Denikin's army. There's a book actually that claims that there was a plot to bomb Moscow, and it seems unlikely. It would have involved a long flight over Russia, and establishing a fuel depot about halfway. And there are suggestions that Churchill actually forbade the flight, but more likely the idea didn't get out of Russia. Right. By December, the White Army's in full retreat, and everyone could see defeat was inevitable. Camels kept flying, both white Russian and RAF, but they did their best, but they couldn't. You can't stop an entire army with small aeroplanes. The RAF spent a lot of time then demanding trains to transfer their personnel to Taganrog and Novorossiysk, ports on the Black Sea. Evacuation was now inevitable. The White Cause was near terminal collapse, and the Red Army just kept coming south. It wasn't easy to get trains. Drivers were generally sympathetic to the Reds, or more sympathetic to the Reds than. So a lot of it was done at gunpoint. They were able to keep some flights going, mainly camels, which all confirmed that the Red Army, seen there, was still advancing and wasn't stopping. By late 1919, early 1920, the weather and the military position just wasn't much flying. They did they borrowed some DH-9s from the Russians, which these are aircraft that had been supplied to Russia, and they because we haven't back for a while, and reconditioned RE8s, carrying out reconnaissance. And one DH9 managed to down a red socket 1.5 strata. You've got a photo there of a red socket 1.5 strata. As the White Gauze inevitable collapse, the RAF mission continued to move south. It was then split into two: Crimea Force, which was sea flight, now with RE8s. There was a hope that the Whites might be able to hang on in the Crimea and keep that as a succeed from Russia, or just keep the Reds away, but doomed. The Kuban Force, which was the rest, A, B, and Z flights, and anyone else they could find. But there was very little flying. By March 1920, the only course open to the British in South Russia: evacuate. Most aeroplanes were wrecked. There are stories in Aiton's book. He says they drove tanks over packing crates that were full of aeroplanes, but it seems unlikely, as the Reds picked up 10 DC9s, DH9s, and quite a number of DH9As. In fact, the Reds were so impressed with the DH9A, they bought some from Aero in the 1920s. But you can see their tanks waiting on a railway train. They disabled those, but the Russians were able to, or the Reds were able to put them back into service. The majority of RAF personnel from South Russia were evacuated from Novorossiysk on HM transport Baron Beck. Now transferred to the Crimea. There was a thought maybe they can hang on in the Crimea, but it was hope. The cause was hopeless. So the rest were evacuated, and but while the evacuation's going on, the Emperor of India bombarded Red positions to keep the Reds back for a while, and the RAF left the Crimea on the 31st of March. General Denikin left just before them. He handed over command of the White Army to General Wrangel. He settled in France, then moved to the USA in 1945 and died in 1947. He's now seen as a hero in Russia, and he was reburied in Moscow in 2005.
Well,
Yeah.
why is it a hero
Mhm.
in Russia?
Not sure. But because now the communist rule wasn't perfect. It might have got Vladimir Putin where he is. Right, two Australians are known to have flown in the RAF in South Russia. Captain Head from Bombala, to the AFC in Mesopotamia before transferring to the RFC, flew 113 Squadron, volunteered for South Russia, and he was one of the instructors, an RE8 instructor. He was awarded the Air Force Cross for his services in Russia. Lieutenant Watson from South Yarra, Victoria, transferred in March 1917, served in 47 Squadron Macedonia, and he was one of the ones that just was moved to Russia. But he stayed and flew with Sea Flight until the RAF left. Further reading, some books that are, if this has excited anyone. Churchill's Secret War with Lenin is probably as close as you'll get to an official history of the campaign in Russia. It's all Commonwealth, British and Commonwealth intervention. It's very good, very detailed. The other one, A Nasty Little War. Anna Reid is a journalist, a British journalist. Very good book, very well written, and the quote is really a summarised version of Billy's remarks about flying in Russia. Churchill's Crusade is again is a general history, but not quite as good as Churchill's war against Lenin. The Day We Almost Bombed Moscow is good, but it does have that error about the plot to bomb Moscow, which I think the author or the authors picked up from a couple of the ex-pilots. And we could have bombed. Anthony Beaver, a recent book on the Russian Civil War. Gone to Russia to Fight is very good. It's all about South Russia. A lot of what I've said is I've summarised things that were in Gone to Russia to Fight. A book about Kincaid. Tragic, a very good pilot, but a tragic end. And Collishaw's story, which was the Queen's thing. Recollections may differ. Some of the things that he said don't seem to quite add up with the official history, but it's still a good read. And finally, Last Train Over Rostov Bridge, read as almost as fiction, but as apart from the flying parts, a lot of them are imagined or ghost written, but the story itself is good. And the other one for them, The War Was Not Over, the story of the Royal Navy in Russia, where we found out about the President Kruger. And so that's it.
Yeah, excellent.
Before you finish up, is there, what were the casualties? Were there many casualties in?
Yeah, I didn't say that. They were fairly light. Where did I put it?
It doesn't matter, but they weren't all that many.
No, I couldn't find definite figures for 221 and 266. 47 Squadron lost one officer was fatally shot by a sentry. He was inspecting a train and walked around, and the sentry thought he was a Bolshevik saboteur. One officer was killed, and 2 wounded by ground fire, and 2 were killed when departing on a raid. There was no campaign medal for any services in Russia, and no official history.
Oh, God.
Which is it's unusual because there were campaign medals for fairly obscure skirmishes on the northwest frontier in India, but not something as big as this. I think once it was over, there was just a general government decision to just forget about it. It just didn't happen. We know of about 120 Australians served in the British Army in North Russia. But to do that, they are part of the North Russia Relief Force, so they had to be discharged from the AIF and immediately re-enlist in the Royal Fusiliers, 45th Battalion Royal Fusiliers, or the Machine Gun Corps.
But you see some war memorials say 1919.
Yeah.
For that reason.
Also, because the war didn't really end until 28 June 1919,
Right.
when the Treaty of Versailles came into effect. Yeah, the troops who went to North Russia continued to wear a slouch hat, and something people don't know: a slouch on a slouch hat is the bit that isn't pinned up. It's the side that, it's slouching down.
So what's the bit that's pinned up called?
The bit that's pinned up.
This is Paul here. I would like to ask a question of Aero.
What's that?
Gord, Des, I'd like to ask a question.
Yeah, we can hear you.
I also recommend that you exit share so that we can see.
So before you do then, Paul, I've got a question I want to ask relating to a particular slide towards the end and also early in the beginning. So, Paul, I mean, are you able to go back to Paul's question?
I can ask my question anyway.
Here we are.
Yes.
So
That's it. I will just go, if you go to the beginning. Anyway, Paul asked his question.
Can I first say that everything is crystal clear here in Istanbul? I've been able to screenshot several slides, expand them, and I have a very good record of the talk. Gareth, it strikes me that in the aftermath of the Great War, the Royal Air Force saw itself as a expeditionary, reacting force that could go as it did to South Russia, but also to Iraq. the northwest frontier, and perhaps other areas. But it didn't really come to fruition. Do you think that the RAF lost an opportunity to assert the importance of air power after the First World War?
Oh, I think they, the Air Force people who were there certainly tried hard, but I think in Russia it was a lost cause anyway. No matter what they did, that just the sheer size of the Red Army, Trotsky got them organised, and the whites really were seemed to be corrupt and not interested. So they were supposedly there to train the whites to take over, but it just didn't happen. So yeah, I think the Air Force people could see what was the potential of air operations, but they didn't really have the equipment to do it.
Hmm.
Right.
If we finished up now, I might just drop out of the thing, or did you want to ask something more?
I did, sorry. Could you
sorry,
just
we're
go
back at the beginning now?
Yeah.
from Mark Francis? Just could you go to the map that's about 3 slides in for a moment? There is. You've got down below there at the bottom the British around Baku, from between the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea, and you talked about operations on the Caspian Sea. Just broadly, where was the operation there? Because Baku, of course, was Dunster Force in 1918.
Yeah, that's when the Spads were there with 30 Squadron. So they were much further north. And if we go to right.
Oh, yep, there's a good.
Okay, if you can, looking on the left-hand side of the Caspian, Petrovsk is the second, is the highest of the town names. You can see Baku in red, and then there are 3 names on that bank of the Caspian, and the top one is what is now was Petrovsk.
Right, got it. Thank you.
Okay, and up north is you can see Astrakhan. If you keep going up the coast. Now Chechen Island was where they established the fueling depot. Is that little peninsula that sticks out just north of Petrovsk.
Because I think my memory is that Dunster Force had to withdraw out through Baku and had to seize some ships, almost in a fighting withdrawal out across the Caspian to rejoin the British forces. I thought they were on the other side, but I hadn't got to it. Great. If you could go to one of the last slides that had the books, you showed the books. I think it was Churchill's War on the whatever.
Yeah.
Right, Churchill's Secret War with Lenin, the previous one.
Yeah. Sorry, hitting the wrong key there. Yes.
That's okay. So that photo on that book, have you read that book? That is, does it cover Dunster Force or is it just other parts?
I think it comes in after Dunster Force.
Okay, interesting.
Tonight and let you know.
Okay, thank you. Because that photo is actually taken in that region. The fellow on the right-hand side is Captain Frank Lord, MCMM, AIF, and was voluntold in December 1917, January 1918. He was one of the 20 selected members from the 5 divisions, 4 from each division, of both sergeants and officers, who showed the same sort of spirit as I'm trying to think of one of the VC winners, the Australian AIF VC winner. Anyway, and he happens to be the grandfather of friends in Melbourne. That's why I know that photo. Interesting. They've used a Dunster Force photo on what is effectively the Russian Civil War. I thought I'd recognise Damien Wright. I don't know if you could see my screen, but that's a book from last year, Australia's Lost Heroes, Anzacs in the Russian Civil War 1919, by the same author, Damien Wright.
Yes. Yeah, I did correspond with him, and he kindly mentioned me in the introduction to both books.
Excellent.
I'm pretty sure it doesn't cover Dunster because he, as it says, it's the military intervention in the Russian Civil War.
Yep.
So Dunster Force was prior to the war, to that war anyway.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I'll
It's
have a look
1980.
and check that.
No, it's just interested. Anyway, it's just interesting they got an Australian on the cover of that book. Just thought, FYI, you might be interested. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, Steve.
Just something about medals. The Allied Victory Medal is 1914 to 1920. The British Victory Medal.
Mm. Right.
Whereas the War Medal is 1914 to 1918.
So they did get a little bit of recognition.
So there was a bit going on still.
Yeah, I was fighting the IRA in Ireland and well, there were other.
Sorry, there was a
Please.
question there about the engines of the Camel. I was just wondering if you saw that in the chat room. I think it came from Carl, our member in the US.
I'll try and find the chat. Hang on.
The question is, any idea of which engine was powering the Camel's 150 Bentley?
I don't think they were, but I'll check.
Yeah, my instinct, if they were from the Middle East and Aegean, they were probably Clergets or something. But Colin Owers might know.
I think that was Clerget's as well.
I know he's online, isn't he? Yes, he is online.
He's somewhere around.
What do you reckon, Colin? The other question I had is the red Newports. I mean, the Russians built some of those under license, and I thought they like made a Newport 21 with only an 80 horsepower engine. But usually in these histories, I'm reading them as Newport 17s, but pretty much they're the same aircraft. I'm just wondering, apart from the engine, whether the Reds were using some of their own licensed built versions, perhaps.
I think they were, but it was the Dux for company in St. Petersburg, I think, was building Newports. And from memory, rather than the silver aluminium dope of a French built Newports, they were sort of a light grey. They look about the same in photographs.
You can't tell.
I think I read somewhere, but can't remember where.
Sorry, I do beg your pardon. Yes, I just now remember the 21 had the cowling like the Newport 11. Does that ring any bells? When you're from photographs, so most of the photographs from Russia seem to be more like a 17, the rounded cowling.
Yeah, they were supplied with some French built, but I think most of them were built in Russia.
It's Paul here. Could you end sharing so we can see everyone?
Okay. I didn't swap over to that because we were still looking at things on the PowerPoint. I'm here beside Gareth. Before we do that, there's a question here about any reference from Carl Priest, any reference to the engine reliability in the DH9s. I remember 1918 Independent Force was having significant engine failure issues, 25% fallout. Any thoughts on that, Gareth?
I haven't come across that in reading of Russia. Maybe they had a better choice of engines, or they had more time to work on it. They didn't have the operational pressure that they had in the Independent Force. But I hadn't come across that. I know that they had a terrible reputation in France. But then the Macintosh and Pera that flew out here from Britain were in DH9, so they managed to get.
Gareth, I think there was a lot of remedial work done, but the Independent Forces aircraft were early on in the piece, and they were basically the Mark Zero of those Puma was that the engine? Yeah. I think that they had a lot of work because the later Royal Australian Air Force DH9s did not have the same reliability problems.
Yeah. I see Colin says that GN Camels in 1918 were Clerget.
Oh, that's answered that.
That's it.